15 for anyone who doesn't know. It's titled The 100 Men Corporation. There's a lot of historical information I found in this. Delighted to have Bill Schaberg, the author, back with us. Bill was on a hiatus last week. We had, of course, Kevin Hanlon stepping in, and he was great. So it's great to have Bill back. And Jim Worley's with us as well, out of A History Only, and we're going to read along with them. So, Mr. Schaberg, we're reading The 100 Men Corporation, and we're in October 1938.
Albert Scott's insistence that AA must become self-supporting through mandatory weekly contributions before any other solicitation of the rich, especially of Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., called for a strong response. The very next day, Thursday, September 29th, Bill and Hank met with Frank Amos to formulate an alternate plan of action. The three men carefully crafted, reviewed, and then edited their response before it was mailed off to Scott on Tuesday, October 4th. Amos concluded this letter with 6 recommendations he wholeheartedly approved. The first 3, and most important of which were, number 1, that the 4 Rockefeller men, quote, endeavor at once to raise $10,000, end quote. Number 2, that, quote, we ascertain what advances we can get from a publisher on a book that might be sufficient for Wilson's bare expenses while writing it, end quote. And number 3, that, quote, Parkhurst continue until November 1st to try and secure contributions, end quote. Regarding the first recommendation, the Rockefeller contingent did make at least some fundraising efforts during this time, but once again they proved to be so completely unsuccessful and raised no new monies to support the work. Wilson was discouraged by these failures, at one point complaining to Frank Amos. I talked to Chipman over a week ago, and he said they would do the best they could, but he had no need to see me. Neither have we heard from Mr. Scott about the prospect he had in mind. It is sad that our personal losses do not concern the trustees, but we think they should concern them because our financial well-being has a direct bearing on the work, and Hank's presence in the picture has a very large bearing on the success of the book and its aftermath. What a lovely concession that is for Bill Wilson. At this point, Bill had at least temporarily abandoned his earlier hopes that the Rockefeller connection would prove to be a gateway to large contributions, and the Alcoholic Foundation would be, quote, a great receptacle for the rich to deposit their money in, end quote. He was finally beginning to concede to himself that this was just not going to happen, at least not at any time in the near future, and he actively began to consider any other option which might bring in some ready cash into their empty checkbooks. It's important to note that in Amos's third proposal, Hank Parkhurst was considered to be the point man for approaching the rich and securing contributions. As Wilson had noted just a few days earlier, Hank was, quote, now doing a great deal of their efforts to raise money, end quote. And this was a position he had held at least since the previous July when Bill went south to collect testimonials for the new movement. In their honest pursuit of this suggestion, both Wilson and Parkhurst continued working on their own list of promising new contacts, but with Hank making direct appeals while Bill wrote the solicitation letters. But once again, their best efforts produced nothing. There was no money coming in from any new outside sources, and now, more than ever, they seem to be completely on their own.
I don't care anyway. It's great to have Bill Schaberg, the author, read this. This is wonderful. Finding a publisher for the book, Bill Schaberg.
This left only Amos's second substantive recommendation as a possible source of ready cash, namely that they abandon the idea of publishing the book themselves and investigate the possibility of finding a publisher who would give them an advance on the proposed book. Fortunately, Frank had a friend named Eugene Exman, who was the religious editor at Harper & Brothers, the prestigious New York publishing house, and he enthusiastically suggested to Bill that, quote, perhaps he would be interested in your new book. Why don't you go down there and show him the few chapters you have done? I'll fix it up for you, end quote. Frank quickly set up an appointment for Bill and Hank, and the two men, quote, got there in a hurry, end quote, meeting with Exman and in his office either on Friday, September 30th, or sometime during the first few days of October. Bill brought copies of There Is a Solution and his own story along with them to this important meeting.
The proposal to Harper is accepted.
Bill was nervous about showing these two chapters to a professional publisher, and painfully aware that he had never written anything like this before, he approached this meeting with some considerable quote unquote trepidation. But his fears proved to be groundless. After the two men provided Exman with a bit of background on who they were and recounted some of their successes over the past 3 years, the two chapters were dutifully handed over. To Wilson's surprise and extreme relief, Gene Exman thoughtfully scanned them and then showed immediate interest in what he was reading. Why, Mr. Wilson, he said, this is, quote, rather interesting. Could you do a whole book like this? End quote. Bill claims he was shaking when asked that question, but he, quote, lied valiantly and said, oh, of course, end quote. Exman next wondered how long it would take for him to finish such a book, and Bill, erring on the side of caution, suggested it might be 9 or 10 months before he would be able to deliver a finished manuscript. Exman was delighted with this and suggested they come back again later after he had had a chance to present the idea of publishing their book to Cass Canfield, the president of Harper and Brothers. On their next visit, Eugene Exman announced he had excellent news. Harper's was definitely interested in publishing their book, and they would be happy to offer a 1,000
Oh, we had a
on all
pause.
sales.
You just paused, Bill, on 1,500. Yeah. They would be happy to offer a 1,500 advance against future royalties. That's where it just paused.
Against future royalties of 10% on all sales?
Yeah, that's it.
Exman explained this advance, quote, would be deducted from your account when the book was finished in 1939, end quote, and they would need to sell 5,000 copies of the book before the advance would be paid back in full. Parenthesis. Note, this means that Harper was projecting a $3 list price for the book, close quote, close parenthesis. This was a generous offer for a first-time author, one which Exman, having heard of their current financial difficulties from his friend Amos, hoped, quote, would help things along, end quote, and made it possible for Wilson to devote himself exclusively to finishing the book. Hearing this, Wilson immediately, reaction was to, quote unquote, get pretty excited. Quote, it made me feel like I was an author or something, end quote, he said. And typical of Bill, he found himself, quote, in the clouds, end quote. After all, it was exhilarating, quote, to know that a firm like Harper's wanted a book and that an editor of Gene's caliber believed it was going to be good, end quote. The two men immediately set off for Frank Amos's office to tell him about the offer. Bill was delighted, quote, to see Frank's face light up when he heard the news, end quote. This in spite of the fact that Wilson was already begun to have serious doubts about the wisdom of accepting Harper's offer.
Hank Parkhurst convinces Bill Wilson to self-publish.
Wilson's elation had actually begun to fade shortly after they left the meeting with Eugene Exman, as Hank Parkhurst immediately began to revisit all of his objections to having someone else publish their book. He had been curious to learn of Harper's evaluation of the book's potential, but as far back as May, Hank had been insisting that they should maintain control of their most important written asset, and he had not changed his mind on this critical point since then. Harper and Brothers offer only reinforced and confirmed his belief that they should publish the book themselves. In fact, he was, quote unquote, vigorously opposed to giving up control and turning their manuscript over to a professional publishing house. As usual, Hank had a laundry list of arguments he felt justified his position, and he presented them in the most forceful way possible. Imagine that. What, he said, if this book, quote, should prove to be the main textbook of AA, why would we want our main means of propagation in the hands of somebody else? Shouldn't we control this thing? End quote. And besides, he contended that if a fine publisher like Harper's thought they could easily sell 5,000 copies of this book, he and Bill shouldn't have to settle for a paltry royalty of 30 cents on each copy when much more profit could be made on every single book by doing the printing and publishing themselves. In addition, this $1,500 may be enough to keep the author solvent for the next 6 months, but it provided nothing for the rest of them, not to mention the expenses involved in maintaining the office. To support their entire operation for 6 months, he noted, would require 4 times what Harper was offering. Finally, and most important, he pointed out that the royalty check would be completely spent by the time the book came out, and there would be no further money from the publisher until substantially more than 5,000 copies had been sold. So, how would they pay for the people and the facilities needed to respond to the, quote, thousands of cries for help from alcoholics and their families, end quote, that would surely pour in once the book was published and began to receive favorable publicity? Individually, these were persuasive arguments, but taken together, they were unassailable, a fact Bill Wilson found both impressive and depressing. At this point, he was forced to admit they had to publish the book themselves, but at the same time, he had no idea how they could go about doing that and was equally sure the Rockefeller trustees would not be in favor of turning down a windfall of $1,500. As one might expect, Hank Parkhurst saw no particular problem with either of these two difficulties.
A break with the trustees.
When they told Amos and Richardson about the offered $1,500 advance, Bill says the two men, quote, smiled happily as they heard the details. It was the first ray of hope they had seen in months, and they were unanimous in their opinion that the Harper deal was the answer, end quote, to the answer to their problems and the best way to resolve their current critical lack of money. Bill had been afraid of this response, and although he was not anxious to go against the advice of these two stalwart supporters, to flatly disagree with these wonderful friends, he said, was the toughest possible assignment. He felt he had no other choice but to do exactly that. Reluctantly, Bill and Hank shared with these two men their grave reservations about the long-term consequences of accepting Harper's offer, and carefully recounted each of their objections with all the persuasive force and conviction they could muster. This was an argument they desperately wanted to win, but as they feared, neither Amos nor Richardson were particularly impressed with their reasoning, and they overrode them by constantly coming back to their primary objection, quote, why, this will never work, they said. It just can't be done. Authors never publish books and get away with it. You are on the wrong track, end quote. Wilson claims he and Parkhurst then, quote, politely but pointedly reminded them there was no money in the foundation, end quote. And given that fact, they saw no reason why they should simply, quote, hand this new coming book, end quote, over to Harper rather than holding on to the ownership and control themselves. These could not have been particularly pleasant meetings, and when everyone had finally had their say, they, quote, ended on a dismal note. We were a hung jury, and no conclusion or verdict was reached, end quote. Wilson was convinced they should refuse the Harper offer, but he wasn't above second-guessing himself when faced with such a momentous decision, and he finally decided to get an expert opinion from the only man he knew with extensive experience in this area, Harper editor Eugene Exman. Bill says, quote, still much disturbed about the whole business, I went back to Gene Exman and frankly explained to him what was about to happen. To my utter amazement, he agreed, quite contrary to his own interest, that a society like ours ought to control and publish its own literature. Moreover, he felt that very possibly we could do this with success, end quote. This bit of unexpected advice from Exman, quote, did not register at all when it was transmitted to the trustees, end quote. And Wilson must have found his inability to change their minds extremely frustrating. Despite the fact that this agreement with their plan came from a reliable and authoritative source, the, quote, trustees stood pat, end quote, and refused to agree with Bill's and Hank's decision to self-publish the book. Wilson and Parkhurst had recently disagreed with Albert Scott over his insistence that were dues at each AA meeting, and now they found themselves on the other side of the fence in this all-important argument with Amos and Richardson. It was unexpected and disconcerting reversal for everyone. Little more than 2 weeks earlier, Bill had written, quote, "Though we are grateful that we have you gentlemen to go to, we do not want to cast too much responsibility on the shoulders of our ever-willing trustees," end quote. As he later noted, the primary impact of Eugene Exman's advice had been to, quote, "give Henry and me the kind of encouragement we so much needed," end quote. And the two men now felt they had no choice but to assume the burden of those responsibilities themselves, signaling an even greater estrangement from the Rockefeller contingent. This was an outcome no one would have predicted on September 26th, when Bill had so carefully crafted his dramatic sheep and goats letter, detailing the severity of their current financial situation and pointedly challenging the trustees to come up with a workable solution. Their growing alienation from Rockefeller's friends was surely the last thing Wilson would have predicted as an outcome when he threw down the gauntlet in that letter, intending more than anything else to move Albert Scott in the direction of approaching John D. Rockefeller Jr. for yet another substantial contribution. Instead, they now found themselves completely rejecting these men's considered advice and, in fact, setting off on a course that was in direct opposition to their mentor's wishes.
Another loan from Charles Towns.
If the Rockefeller trustees and advisors were unalterably opposed to the self-publication of the book and could not be counted on to raise any immediate cash to support the writing, then there was just one other person to whom Bill could reliably turn for help. Charles B. Towns had given him a $500 check in mid-May, specifically in support of the book project, and he had made another more general $500 contribution in late August that had been judiciously divided and distributed to Wilson, Parkhurst, and Mayo as they needed it. The May check had made it possible for Bill to write the first 2 chapters of the book. And now, Charles Towns seemed to be the only person willing to step up and provide the money that would be so essential if Wilson was to devote his time to writing the rest of the book. But Bill was worried that taking any more money from Towns might be misconstrued as an overt endorsement of his New York hospital, and he had spent almost 2 full pages of his sheep and goats letter detailing the history of his relationship with Towns and evaluating the positive and negative aspects of taking any further monies from him. But after all of these pluses and minuses had been carefully noted and evaluated, it still came down to the inescapable fact that, as Bill candidly told the trustees, quote, "The only certainty of funds is Mr. Towns, and I think he is willing to finance the completion of the book if no other way can be found," close quote. In the 2 weeks since Bill had written that letter, no other way had been found, and in fact, several formerly high hopes had been completely dashed. This left Charles Towns as their only viable option.
Towns agrees to finance the rest of the book.
Towns was certainly willing to finance the completion of the book, and indeed he later claimed that he had, quote, voluntarily proposed to loan Wilson enough money to finish it. In Charles's own recollections of that conversation, recounted in a later letter to Bill, he said, quote, "I voluntarily proposed that you hire a stenographer, which you considered could be done for $25 per week. And you said that all you wanted was an advance of $50 per week for yourself, and I told you to go ahead," end quote. Once they had made the decision to reject the Harper advance, Bill had no other choice but to accept Charles Towns's generous offer. Having reached that decision, they came to an agreement in the second week of October, and Charles wrote Bill his first check on October 14th, 1938, and continued making regular payments over the next several months, generally sending him a check on the 11th of each month. Bill confirmed the details of this October arrangement the following January in a letter to Frank Amos, plainly telling him that, quote, "Mr. Towns has subsidized me at the rate of $200 per month, plus $100 more per month for Ruth Hawk, who has worked with me," end quote. and that it was this arrangement which had allowed him to finish writing the book.
Deciding to accept this money from Towns, which Wilson always acknowledged as a loan, and that was dutifully paid in full over the next few years, was the only way Bill could survive once he rejected the trustees' advice regarding the Harper's advance. At this critical juncture, Wilson was well aware that taking money from the man who owned Towns Hospital might be misconstrued by suspicious people and expose them to the accusations of participating in a racket to make money from other people's suffering. But Bill felt this was a risk they would just have to take. There really was no other choice. Making this deal all the more attractive and even more difficult to refuse was the fact that Charles Towns' advance of $300 a month for 5 months was identical to the $1,500 Bill would have received from Harper. The loan could be repaid from the book's profits once it was published, while the publisher's advance amounted to an outright purchase. Rejecting the Harper advance and agreeing to take Towns' money was the obvious, logical path to take, achieving all of their major goals by financing the ongoing writing while simultaneously retaining ownership and control of the book, and in addition allowing them to use the profits from the book immediately after it was published to finance the work, rather than waiting for more than 5,000 copies to be sold before they would see any further royalties from the publisher. According to Towns, this arrangement with Wilson included the fact that they quoted, discussed the subject of the manuscript before it was written and agreed upon a policy, end quote, regarding how the writing and review process would be accomplished, and Bill was no less regular in his compliance with this part of the agreement than Charles was in sending the monthly check. Just days after receiving the first payment, Wilson sent a copy of the new chapter off to Towns for his review, noting briefly, quote, "Here's the latest. Still going strong. Many thanks to you," end quote. Exactly what chapter this might have been is uncertain. Certainly, Towns had already seen the frequently revised versions of There Is a Solution in Bill's story, so it was likely a reworked or more polished version of More About Alcoholism, or perhaps even We Agnostics, parenthesis, which had only been available in the, quote, original dictation and in the, quote, rough uncorrected outline when Bill had sent them to Dr. Bob 3 weeks earlier. Charles was delighted with what he read, responding on October 19th.
Dear Bill, received your letter this morning, and I think this chapter is wonderful. I cannot help but marvel at the way you are able to analyze and present this phase of your work, and I am satisfied that with the other material this book will contain, the semi-religious nature, it is going to immediately create an interest among the ministers of the world. The way in which you have presented this is entirely your own, and it could not be more clearly presented.
Obviously, Charles was not going to be a very critical or intrusive reviewer when it came to Bill's writings, but the next paragraph shows that Towns was not bashful about offering some creative marketing suggestions for the book.
I believe in time, as far as the Rockefeller Institute is concerned, John D. will find that it is up to him to present a copy to every religious institution in the world and many public libraries. In other words, I think that he could distribute about 500,000 copies. Also, I believe when Fosdick reads his material, he will be the man to interest Mr. Rockefeller. I am more than pleased with what you have done. Very truly yours, Charles B. Towns.
Whatever the origin of this ambitious idea of Rockefeller distributing 500,000 copies of the book, parenthesis, had Charles been talking to Hank Parkhurst, question mark, close parenthesis. It was not the last time this suggestion would be made, although the project never caught the imagination of the great philanthropist and therefore it never came to fruition. Charles B. Towns was not a rich man, certainly not on the order of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his friends, but his confidence in Bill Wilson and his program of recovery far exceeded the combined faith of all of those men, and he demonstrated that faith by writing these all-important monthly checks. When talking about the essential help he gave at this decisive point in the story, Charles Towns claimed that he had, quote, never sought any credit nor publicity in this matter, and I don't care for any, end quote. But it is a sad fact that this man, one of the great unsung heroes in the story of the writing of the Big Book, continues to receive so little credit for his critical role in making it possible for the book to be written.
Parker's plan: sell stock in a separate publishing company. But the biggest problem with the Towns arrangement to support Bill Wilson and Ruth Hawk for the next several months was that Hank Parker still had no income to pay his mortgage, support himself, his wife, and children, and cover the monthly expenses of maintaining the office in Newark. Some other source of money was clearly needed, and with the prospect of a publishing book on the near horizon, Hank just, quote, champed at the bit, end quote, to take the group in a completely different direction than the one they had pursued for the past year.
The weekend after Bill received his first check from Towns, the two men found themselves in Hank's backyard in Montclair, New Jersey, where Parkhurst marshaled his considerable promotional skills to sell Bill on the idea that it was time for them to ignore the advice offered by the non-alcoholic trustees and advisors and declare their independence from the ineffective Alcoholic Foundation. According to Hank, what they needed to do was to form their own publishing company, even if that meant they would, quote, would have to forget about the foundation, end quote, and then sell stock in that company to raise the cash that they so desperately needed. Wilson called Parkhurst a, quote, terrific power driver and a, quote, hard-hitting salesman. And his last recounting of Hank's arguments and his style that afternoon in New Jersey, he said, quote, sold his bill of goods, end quote, seems to capture accurately the force of the dynamic presentation Parkhurst made to him that day. Hey, look here, Bill. Why do we bother anymore with those trustees and that foundation? Those folks haven't raised a cent, and they're not going to. Why don't we put this proposed book on a business basis and form a stock company? Let's sell shares to our own folks right here in New York. If we give them a real argument, I'll guarantee they will get up the dough.
Wilson later claimed that as, quote unquote, an ex-Wall Streeter, he, quote, had already toyed with this notion. But Henry had much bigger ideas, and he breathed confidence, end quote, to such a degree that Bill was soon swept away by this tempting and adventurous new scheme. The exact nature of Hank's bigger ideas became clearer as he explained his proposal for how the stock plan would work. Parker suggested that they issue 600 shares of stock, retaining 200 shares each for themselves as author and business manager, while selling the remaining 200 shares for $25 each, thereby raising the $5,000 needed to support both him and his office-based promotional activities for the next several months. While Bill was attracted to the idea of selling stock as a way to support Hank for the next several months, not to mention the fact that he would be receiving $5,000 worth of stock for his work as author, he was more than a little concerned about how the trustees would react to this radical new approach to fundraising. In fact, he was convinced they, quote, would never agree to this scheme, end quote. And he worried that, quote, to flatly disagree, end quote, with these men might seriously, quote, hurt their feelings, end quote. Something he desperately wanted to avoid lest it should jeopardize access to future charitable donations. Quote, but Henry's skin was thicker than mine, Bill noted. He was implacable. He said that it simply had to be done, and I finally agreed, end quote.
A break with the Rockefeller Group.
Ever the salesman, and as a concession to Bill's growing anxiety over the trustees, Hank proposed they offer the foundation a financial incentive in the hope that this might make it easier for the non-alcoholic trustees to accept his plan for a stock offering. Parker suggested the new publishing company pay the Alcoholic Foundation a, quote, full royalty of 35 cents, end quote, on every book sold, this being a nickel more than the 30 cents offered by Harper, and thereby increasing the foundation's potential profits from each sale by almost 17%. As a businessman, This was an argument that made perfect sense to Hank Parkhurst, and he presumed it would have an equally powerful impact on the reluctant trustees. Once he had worked out the details of the new plan, Bill and Hank, quote, were so overcome with this idea that they burned up the telephone to Willard Richardson in New York and even to Ohio, where Frank Amos, end quote, was still enjoying his 3-week vacation. Having presented the basic outline of the new company and the stock plan, the question was simple enough. Quote, would you therefore be in favor that we make an effort to secure stock subscriptions for a corporation to take over the book on the terms we have just described, end quote? Bill had, quote, anticipated that the reaction would be bad, and it certainly was, end quote. Neither Richardson nor Amos approved of the idea, and they both, quote, counseled caution before they took any steps further to implement this rash new venture. But Bill Wilson knew he would have to go through with the deal despite all the objections. It was the only way they could keep their heads above water while getting the book written, although he found this prospect, quote unquote, depressing. Making such a dramatic break with his Rockefeller friends was the last thing he wanted to do, but it had to be done.
The 100 Men Corporation is formed.
Quote, the very next day, end quote, Wilson and Parkhurst, quote, went to a stationery store and bought a pad of stock certificates, end quote. Back in the Newark office, Hank had Ruth Hawk type, quote, 100 Men Corporation, par value $25, end quote, at the top of each blank share, and then confidently signed his name across the bottom as, quote unquote, Henry G. Parkhurst, President. Wilson later claimed that on seeing this, he, quote, protested these irregularities. But Henry said there was no time to waste. Why be concerned with small details, end quote. If this did happen, it's unlikely it was much of an argument because the entire 100 Men Corporation was a Hank Parkhurst project from start to finish. And the money they were trying to raise was going to be used to support him, not Wilson. Who else but Hank should be president of this new publishing company? And so the new company, to raise money for the book project and to ensure that they, quote unquote, control this thing, had been created with the help of a few blank stock certificates and the bold stroke of a pen. Now they just had to figure out how to package the company in such a way so that people would spend some of their hard-earned cash to buy those rather dicey-looking homemade shares of stock.
Great stuff. Selling stock for profit versus one drunk helping another. Before moving on to Hank's sales promotion campaign, there are a number of important things that need to be noted about this stock offering.
To begin with, it was perfectly reasonable for Hank Parkhurst to suggest in October that they raise money by selling something of potential value. The previous May, in his letter to Bert Taylor and Bill Wilson, Hank had proposed that, quote, donations to the Alcoholic Foundation would be solicited to finance the writing and publication of the book for alcoholics. But in the intervening 5 months, despite the fact that these donations were actually loans to be repaid out of the book's profit, they had not been able to convince a single person other than Charles Towns to contribute to this important project. Towns had written a $500 check in May and another in August, but other than these two contributions secured by Bill Wilson, Hank Parkhurst's plan had been an abysmal failure. Given that disappointment, it's almost predictable that Hank's next step would be to offer an economic incentive to those willing to finance this phase of the book's publication. If generosity of spirit and the desire to support a worthy cause could not motivate people to open their checkbooks, then perhaps it was time to fall back on the always reliable profit motive to get the funds he needed. An infusion of cash was absolutely essential if they were ever going to get the book published, and if the only remaining way to raise those funds was to appeal to people's selfish economic interest, well then so be it. It might not be the ideal situation, but it seemed to be the only option left at this point. Without some source of significant financing, all their hopes of publishing the book would collapse like the proverbial house of cards. This shift from donations to the sale of stock was both radical and fateful. Parkhurst was now enlisting support for the book project, and indirectly for himself, by promising buyers they would make money from their investment, injecting the always contentious financial element, the fear that, quote, money is going to ruin this thing, end quote, into the very heart of all their efforts. With his stock scheme, Hank abandoned the virtuous let's do this because it's the right thing to do approach and adopted instead an unmistakably mercenary appeal for people to, quote, join us in the book project because you will make a lot of money, end quote. Other than the potentially harmful effects of this decided materialistic approach might have on the New York membership, the great downside of Hank's stock plan was that with this one fateful decision, he had realized all of Akron's worst fears about the New York obsession with money. People buying stock in this publishing company were no longer making donations to generously support an emerging fellowship that promised sobriety to the suffering alcoholic. Instead, they were writing checks because they had been promised a substantial return on their investment. The altruistic, quote, one drunk talking to another drunk, end quote, movement had suddenly been turned into a racket, an organization seriously tainted by the explicit promise that people would make some easy money off it.
Fortunately, Dr. Bob avoided, at least for the moment, the explosion that would have resulted had the Akron members heard about Hank's stock plans. He was so dubious about the whole scheme, although he did, quote unquote, consent to it, that after listening to Bill's explanation of the plan, he suggested that, quote, it would be unwise at this stage to lay the matter before the Akron membership, end quote. Bob judiciously concluded there was already more than enough hostility in Ohio toward Bill Wilson and the New York way of doing things without it being further inflamed by this news of Parkhurst's money-making scheme for the book. Smith concluded that the best way to handle this potentially volatile situation was to simply not mention Hank's stock offer to the Akron membership at all. Once again, just as he had done with his secret trip to meet the Rockefeller Group in December, and his lack of candor about Frank Amos's connections with John D. Rockefeller Jr. during his Akron visit the previous February, Bob decided it would be best to just leave the Ohio group in the dark about this sensitive and sensational information.
Joint ownership of the proposed enterprise.
But the possibility that this profit-making scheme might corrupt the New York Fellowship paled in comparison to the fact that besides selling 200 shares of stock, Hank was making the very generous gift of an additional 200 shares each to himself and Bill Wilson. As noted in an early version of the prospectus for the 100 Men Corporation, quote, 200 shares will be issued to the author and 200 shares will be received by another member of our group, an experienced publicity man who will undertake the business conduct of the enterprise and handle the sale of the volume, end quote. What might be seen as an overtly generous gift of stock in the new company was, from Hank's perspective, simply appropriate compensation for all the work he and Bill were doing to create the book and then launch it as a successful business venture. At this stage, this $5,000 asset was nothing more than a paper profit, one that would be completely worthless unless they produced and successfully marketed the book. But if they did manage to publish a bestseller, then the profits from these sales would generate significant details for all of the stockholders, including Hank Parkhurst and Bill Wilson. In the prospectus he would soon create, Hank predicted that the sale of 15,000 copies would generate a profit of $10 per share after the initial investment of $25 had been returned, along with the more aggressive prediction that selling 100,000 copies would result in a dividend of $150 per share. Parkhurst even went so far as to speculate that, quote, although it may sound ridiculous, one estimate has been made of 500,000 volumes within 2 years time. Should this come, over $900 per share would be returned, end quote. These are clearly not insignificant numbers, especially for two men owning 200 shares of the company's stock. A dividend of $10 would pay them $2,000 each. One of $150 would return $30,000. And in the unlikely event that Hank's ridiculous prediction of 500,000 copies in 2 years actually did come true, they would each have received $180,000 in dividends during that time. Numbers like these lend at least some credence to the resentful comments made by Hank Parker's son many years later, including the one that, quote, that his father and Bill both expected to make $1 million from the project, end quote. However close that allegation may be to the truth, Hank Parker's formation of the 100 Men Corporation and his outright gift of 200 shares to both himself and Bill Wilson obviously put these men in line to make quite a lot of money from the book should it prove to be successful. But even more disturbing than this is the fact that of who now actually owned the new company. Bill later candidly acknowledged that, quote, the New York alcoholics and their friends could buy 1/3 of these shares for cash. The other 2/3 would be distributed between Hank, Henry, and me for our work, end quote. What this casual statement fails to make clear is the plain fact that if Wilson and Parkhurst held 400 shares between them and the remaining stockholders controlled a total of only 200 shares, then the publishing company and the book would belong to Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst rather than to Alcoholics Anonymous. Suddenly, the question Hank asked Bill while they were trying to convince him to adopt this stock proposal, quote, shouldn't we control this thing, end quote, takes on a completely different meaning from the one so commonly understood today.
This startling fact of their joint ownership of the company and the book has been all but lost in the mythology that has grown up around the early years of the 100 Men Corporation, which later became Works Publishing Company. Bill rather blithely states in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age that their intention was that, quote, our society would organize its own publishing company because a society like ours ought to control and publish its own literature, end quote. But at this point in the story, it wasn't the society organizing the publishing company, and it wasn't the society who would control the book it published. That control would lie with Hank Parkhurst and with Bill Wilson and with no one else. On some level, this is understandable and perhaps even forgivable. To begin with, the two men were completely broke, and as they had told the trustees the previous September, if they could not secure some sort of ongoing financial support, they would have to stop working with alcoholics and apply for regular jobs just to put food on the table and pay the mortgage. In October 1938, commandeering the income from a successful book looked to be the only plausible way for them to get a steady income stream, both in the short and long term, for themselves and for the work that needed to be done. In addition, the two active non-alcoholic trustees of the foundation, Frank Amos and Willard Richardson, were both unalterably opposed to the scheme to self-publish a book, and they would surely have blocked any funds from leaving the foundation's coffers in support of a project they considered to be completely unworkable.
A disastrous misstep.
But whatever justification might be offered, and however unavoidable it may have seemed at the time, this stock offer was the single most serious misstep made by Bill Wilson during the so-called flying blind period of AA's history. Yes, the responsibility for both the idea and the promotion rests primarily with Hank Parkhurst, making it easy enough to argue that it was his mistake and not Bill Wilson's. But characterizing Parkhurst as, quote, the serpent in the garden, end quote, of this selfless new recovery movie is just too convenient, completely ignoring the fact that Wilson undeniably accepted the apple Hank offered him, and he took a bite. Less than 2 years later, everyone had realized that this stock scheme, despite its success in sustaining Hank Parkhurst and his promotional efforts from November right through April, was a complete disaster. In May 1940, Bill and Hank signed their 400 shares over to the Alcoholic Foundation, and with a 1942 loan from John D. Rockefeller Jr., negotiated by A. Leroy Chipman, the foundation bought back all the 25 shares at face value and thereby assumed ownership of both the publishing company and the book.
Advice from a successful publisher.
The first thing needed if they were going to sell this stock was some hard facts about what would be involved in this amateur publishing venture. Facts demonstrating that the new company would be established on a solid business basis, allowing them to present a quote unquote real argument when pitching the stock to local AA members. Fortunately, someone within their immediate circle had a personal friendship with Richard J. Walsh, the owner of the John Day Publishing Company, and actually knew him well enough to secure Hank and Bill an appointment. This introduction was no small matter. Walsh's company was the publisher of, among other books, The Good Earth, one of the great blockbuster novels of the 1930s. Parentheses, the book had been the #1 bestseller in both 1931 and 1932. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1932 and was the work most responsible for the author Pearl Buck receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938. Close parentheses. Richard Walsh gave Wilson and Parkhurst a considerable amount of his time and attention, providing them with reliable and valuable information on, quote, printing, credit, and sales, end quote, of a self-published work, along with his own confident prediction of, quote, an unusual sale for the volume, end quote. Perhaps most important was his assurance that given their circumstances and their desire to maintain control of the proposed book, quote, he could not see where this venture would gain through using an established publisher, end quote. This was exactly what Bill and Hank had been hoping to hear. Yet another professional opinion confirming the validity of their plan to publish the book themselves. According to Walsh, the printing of the book should not cost any more than 34 cents a copy. This, taken with the royalty of 35 cents to the Alcoholic Foundation and an allowance of 5 cents for packaging and drayage, would result in a maximum cost of just 74 cents per book. If the book had a retail price of $3 a copy, it would produce a gross profit of 88 cents on each book sold through a bookstore, parentheses, after deducting the traditional jobber's discount of $1.38, close parentheses, and a $2.07 gross profit on every copy sold by direct mail after allowing 19 cents each for wrapping, addressing, and postage. Walsh presumed that as a result of the publicity Hank was then so busily planning, they would be able to sell at least one book via direct mail order for every 2 books sold in stores, resulting in an average gross profit of $1.27 per book.
This was wonderful news to the fledgling publishers. If Hank needed any further convincing about the feasibility of his vision for the 100 Men Corporation, these numbers decisively confirmed all of his most optimistic hopes. This was going to be a very profitable business venture, and once he projected those profit numbers onto the fantastic number of books he envisioned selling, it made the investment of a mere $2,500 for one share in the 100 Men Corporation look like a tremendous bargain. How could the folks in New York not get up the dough when presented with such a surefire proposition as this?
The New York members aren't buying.
Bill was excited by what they learned from Richard Walsh, but these projections made Parkhurst wildly enthusiastic, and he immediately began aggressively selling the New York members, pushing them to jump on this fabulous opportunity while they still had the chance. Bill reported that Hank, quote, descended like a whirlwind on the New York alcoholics, end quote, and they, quote, buttonholed them one by one, persuading, browbeating, hypnotizing, end quote. He said that Parkhurst knew all of the, quote, strategies of a super salesman, end quote, and he used every one of them in his efforts to separate people from the $25 or more they needed to make this investment. Meanwhile, Bill claims, quote, he was no second rater at this sort of thing, end quote, himself, and he, quote, followed right along, backing up all of Hank's arguments and prodding people to take out their checkbooks. According to the 2 promoters, this was a once-in-a-lifetime ground floor offering that people would be just crazy to miss. Nobody was buying. Over and above the fact that most of the newly recovered men had absolutely no disposable income, they were also very skeptical of the basic arguments Hank and Bill were trying to sell. Wilson said the typical alcoholic response was often accompanied by a quote-unquote stony look and the disdainful observation that, quote, you fellows certainly have some nerve. You mean to say you're asking us to buy stock in a book you haven't even been written yet, end quote? It sounded like a harebrained pie-in-the-sky scheme rather than a solid business proposition to these people. Despite Hank's quote-unquote violent promotion, they found it impossible to sell even one share of stock. Quote, obviously, they needed still stronger arguments, end quote, if this ambitious new fundraising effort was ever going to get off the ground. Bill said Henry was not discouraged. He still had ideas. Billy said, you and I know this book is going to sell, and Harper's thinks it will sell, but these New York drunks just do not believe it. Some take it as a joke, and the rest talk high and holy about mixing a spiritual enterprise with money and promotion. But if they really think that the book would sell, they would buy the stock all right and fast. Parker's was convinced that the promise of national publicity was the best way for them to start getting some traction with their sales efforts. If they could just get a commitment from one of the big national magazines to print an article promoting the book just as it was about to be published, they would surely be guaranteed a huge sale in the first few months that 100 Men was out.
Good Housekeeping is approached.
The first magazine approached was Good Housekeeping, where they met with the editor, William Bigelow. The appointment had been set up by an established author named Wainwright Evans, who had published 2 books in the late 1920s and who had almost 20 years of freelance writing experience to his credit. His connection with the growing AA movement is unclear, but it may well have been the result of the many articles he had published on the occult and the paranormal, a topic that ran an abiding interest for Wilson throughout his life. Evans was clearly well enough known to Bigelow that he was able to secure a meeting after he sent the editor a letter regarding the work being done with alcoholics and requesting an appointment. Wainwright Evans accompanied Bill and Hank to the meeting, and Bigelow was so impressed with their presentation that he asked Evans, quote, to submit an outline of the completed article which he believed would be used by the magazine just prior to the issuance of the book, close quote. This was what the 3 men were hoping to hear, and Hank Parkhurst must have been overjoyed to see his plan for getting them some substantial and reputable national publicity unfolding so flawlessly on their very first attempt. An article like this in Good Housekeeping magazine would generate literally thousands of requests for the book. Evans quickly finished his detailed outline and submitted it to Bigelow, but it turned out that the management at Good Housekeeping had some of the same issues and questions raised by This Week magazine the previous month. Quote, though by no means unfavorably disposed, close quote, toward the proposed article, the editor subsequently told Evans there were several serious concerns that would need to be addressed before his magazine would be willing to print this article. It must be remembered that this was the heyday of the famous Good Housekeeping seal of approval, one of the earliest and most successful consumer protection efforts in history. And the magazine was not about to publish any new solution for alcoholism until Wilson and Parkhurst had provided them with some answers to several difficult questions. Bigelow pointed out the problematic fact that they were anonymous, which was all good and well in itself, but raised the question of what he should do with the flood of inquiries they would undoubtedly receive after publishing this article. And he wanted details on how these inquiries were going to be used once Wilson and Parkhurst received them. The editor also suspiciously questioned whether the fantastic results were really what they claimed them to be, which was a difficult proposition to prove to a skeptic's satisfaction. Quote, Furthermore, the editor asked, is there going to be any continuity to the work? Close quote. And exactly, quote, what is going to be done for or said to the distressed people who write asking for an answer? Close quote. Relating this battery of still unanswered questions to Frank Amos almost 3 months later, Bill Wilson noted that of course we can't answer all these questions yet, because we do not know what our finances will be or what the trustees think should be done, close quote. Bigelow's questions and his demand for answers was a stark reality check on how unprepared AA was at that time to field any kind of effective response if they were faced with an onslaught of appeals for information and help. Which was the problem Wilson had been complaining about so bitterly since the publication of their own book became a real possibility. They were, after all, nothing more than a small handful of men and one secretary possessing no infrastructure for handling such requests and having no visible means of support, either for themselves or for their fledgling organization. Like the proposed piece in This Week magazine, the possibility of publishing Wainwright Evans's article in Good Housekeeping limped along for several more weeks without any real resolution until, despite Parkhurst's and Wilson's reluctance to give up hope, it was finally abandoned as yet another failed attempt to convince the national media to publicize their fabulous new cure for alcoholism.
The Reader's Digest meeting.
A few days after their visit to Good Housekeeping, Wilson and Parkhurst had a much more successful trip to Pleasantville, New York, where they met with Kenneth Payne, the managing editor of Reader's Digest. This was perhaps their most ambitious attempt at national publicity, given the Digest's monthly circulation of 12 million copies, and with individual magazines being passed among several readers, and many being bought for the sole purpose of being prominently displayed in the waiting rooms of professional offices across the country. It was a magazine read by more Americans every month than any other publication. Exactly how they managed to secure this appointment with a well-placed and powerful man such as Payne is uncertain. As noted earlier, a reporter from the Digest had attended a regular Tuesday night meeting in Brooklyn on August 30th, presumably in pursuit of a potential story. This appears to have been another one of Hank Parkhurst's attempts to get national publicity for AA, and 2 days later, he followed up the reporter's visit with a letter to DeWitt Wallace, the founder and owner of Reader's Digest.
September 1, 1938. Mr. DeWitt Wallace, care of Reader's Digest, Pleasantville, New York. Dear Sir, the writer is one of a group of ex-alcoholics who held a meeting last Tuesday evening, August 30th, which your Mr. McCarthy attended. Mr. McCarthy informed us that he was making a staff report on this meeting. If you are interested in the significance of the work, several of us would be glad to drop in to see you at Pleasantville in order to give you a more personal glimpse. Thanking you for your interest as expressed by Mr. McCarthy, we are yours very truly, HGP:RH.
While there is no preserved response to this, it seems someone within the AA circle had some sort of personal relationship or contact within Reader's Digest, and 6 weeks later had been able to facilitate the scheduling of this critical meeting for Wilson and Parkhurst. The two men made the hour-long drive up to Pleasantville, New York, and arrived at Kenneth Payne's office in a state of high excitement. Payne was interested in what they had to tell them, and he listened attentively as Bill and then Hank, quote, drew a glowing picture of their fellowship, end quote, describing for him, quote, this wonderful budding society, end quote, along with its recent development and growth. They also did not fail to mention, parentheses, end quote, in a discreet way, end quote, in parentheses, the high interest of Mr. Rockefeller and some of his friends. And Bill made at least passing reference to the fact that he had recently spoken with Harry Emerson Fosdick and received his blessing for the work they were doing. Wilson then presented Payne with the 2 sample chapters from the book, which he said was, quote, then in process of being written, end quote, and gave him sufficient time to read them over. The editor was duly impressed. commenting that he found these 2 chapters to be more than good. They were positively, quote unquote, inspired. With such a favorable response, Wilson, or more likely Parkhurst, went for the close by asking if an article describing a group such as theirs would not, quote, be a matter of tremendous interest to the Reader's Digest, end quote. Kenneth Payne's reply was, quote, most enthusiastic, end quote. And he admitted that, yes, quote, this is just exactly the kind of thing Reader's Digest would like. We'd love to do a piece about your promising young society, one alcoholic talking to another, all very dramatic. Yes, we'll put a feature writer on it, end quote. And he then spoke about how he intended to give the article considerable space in that issue of the magazine. Having gotten this far and beginning to feel a bit more confident, Hank pressed on to make sure they had an explicit understanding about what he considered to be the most critical element regarding this proposed article. Quote, but Mr. Payne, he asked, will you mention the new book in this piece? End quote. The editor replied definitively that, quote, yes, we will mention the book, end quote. The 2 men were elated, but the editor's intention to start work on the story immediately posed something of a problem for them. While an article published in the Digest would be a huge coup, it would do them little good if it came out too far in advance of the publication of the book. Asking for a favor at this point may have seemed presumptuous, but they really had no choice. So Hank politely asked Payne if the piece could be timed so that it would appear just as their book was being published, explaining that once they had their, quote, methods set out on paper, end quote, they would be much better prepared to respond to the thousands of inquiries that an article in the Digest would generate. Kenneth Payne instantly understood their dilemma, and asked how long it would take to do the book. Wilson suggested it should be ready for publication sometime in the spring of 1939, and the editor was more than happy to work with that deadline. When your book is ready next spring, he said, let me know, and I think we can put a feature writer to work. This would be a great story, end quote. Their meeting lasted an hour and concluded with Payne assuring that they had a quote unquote a deal, along with his promise that they would, quote, take the story up the editorial board as soon as possible and, quote, when the time is right, we'll put a special feature writer on this thing and we'll tell everyone about your society, end quote. Wilson and Parkhurst could not have been happier. They had just successfully negotiated the placement of a story about Alcoholics Anonymous in a national magazine with a paid monthly circulation of 12 million copies, an article that would surely bring them more publicity than even Hank had ever imagined in his wildest dreams. The 2 men, quote, reached for their hats and sped back to New York, end quote. Now they, quote, had some real ammunition, end quote, and enough solid arguments to assure even the most skeptical buyer that they would, quote, someday get their money back, end quote. Both men were confident that the promise of a story in Reader's Digest, parenthetically, especially one that would be timed to appear just as the book was being published, end parentheses, finally, quote, gave them the argument they needed to pry the money loose from the drunks, end quote. Surely, with the help of Reader's Digest, they would be able to sell some of those $25 shares of stock.
Hank's prospectus.
With this firm commitment from Reader's Digest, Hank Parkhurst immediately went into promotional overdrive, quote, sitting up nights working on a prospectus, end quote, explaining the surefire profitability of the proposed book business. After some considerable editing, he had Ruth Hawk type up multiple copies for him and Bill to use while promoting the $25 shares in the 100 Men Corporation. This original type version of this prospectus was 8 pages long. Parenthesis, a few weeks later, it would be a slightly revised 12-page version, which was typeset, close parenthesis. And it opened with a, quote, brief resume of the work of Alcoholics Anonymous, end quote. Hank had wasted no time in taking this opportunity to finally present the historical background of AA that he considered so important to selling their solution, and that back in early June he had suggested to Bill as the ideal opening for a book, arguing that, quote, a history of the work. Possibly this could be carried on in the first 2 pages of the book. This history should establish proof of success of the work and carry hope to everyone that reads that much. The opening of the book should arouse the emotion of hope. In the brief resume of the work in the prospectus, Hank actually used Bill Wilson's full name, William G. Wilson, and gave him sole credit for, quote, certain ideas that came to him which forced the basis of the events which have since transpired, end quote. But Parkhurst is not about to squander this chance to promote his own, much less religious understanding of their solution. And he quickly goes on to note how, quote, doctors and psychiatrists have agreed that the only way out for the true alcoholic is through a so-called spiritual experience, and it matters little from what form that experience takes, end quote. Furthermore, he says, quote, this spiritual feature must be simple and understandable, end quote, if it is to be, quote, acceptable to the ordinary men of the world, end quote, and its presentation must be packaged with, quote, accurate and reliable medical information, end quote, if the new prospect is to be, quote, readily persuaded that he is hopeless, end quote. But William G. Wisdom's most brilliant contribution, he claims, went far beyond just simplifying the spiritual feature and recognizing the importance of accurate medical information. All of these elements have been well known to professionals for years, but they have been employed with comparatively little success when it came to sobering up alcoholics. According to Hank, Bill's major insight, quote, Bill's major insight came when he, quote, conceived the idea, end quote, that this failure to help suffering alcoholics, quote, was because the matter was so often presented to an alcoholic by a non-alcoholic, end quote. And this universally lopsided approach did not provide, quote, the sufficient basis of mutual confidence, end quote, so critical for success. Wilson, quote, realized that one alcoholic could gain the confidence of another to an extent that no other person in the world could, and that once this, quote, idea takes hold of the imagination, end quote, it led him to a vision of, quote, one alcoholic helping another, and that one helping still another, end quote, as the one truly effective way to spread the message of recovery and of bringing sobriety to an telling of their story. AA's singular success was more the result of fellowship between alcoholics than any other single event. Hank then briefly recounted Bill's trip to Akron and related how it resulted in 3 Ohio men recovering before he returned to New York. In the 3 years since then, quote, about 200 cases of hopeless alcoholics have been dealt with, end quote, and, quote, about 50% of these have recovered, end quote, with the net result that, quote, the original Akron 3 have expanded themselves into more than 70, end quote, scattered among New York and the seaboard states. There are about 40, end quote, men who have completely recovered from their previously insoluble problem with drink. Having outlined the basic history of AA, Hank then launched into a section he entitled, quote, the present program, end quote. He began by stating categorically that, quote, it has been felt vitally necessary to spread the work widely and get it on a sound basis rapidly, quote, noting that the first step in this process, quote, has been the establishment of a trust known as the Alcoholic Foundation, end quote. After briefly describing the structure and responsibilities of the foundation, Hank then moved on to the real topic under consideration, the need for, quote, education and instruction of an estimated million alcoholics in this country, end quote, in, quote, the nature of the disease and its cure, end quote, and the decision, therefore, to publish a book, quote, based upon the past 4 years of experience, end quote, so that their, quote, definite program of attitude and action, end quote, could be offered to everyone affected by this malady. In conclusion, he noted, quote, the publishing of this book, to be known as 100 Men, is the subject of the attached material, end quote. With all this groundwork carefully in place, Hank then proceeded to detail, quote, unquote, the proposal, namely their plan to form, quote, the 100 Men Corporation, whose purpose would be to publish the 100 Men book. Shares of, quote, unquote, non-assessable stock issued by a Delaware corporation would be offered in this new company for $25 each, and the proceeds of the sale would be used to, quote, promote publicity, sales, and to publish the book, end quote. Painfully aware of just how little disposable income there was among the recovered drunks and alcohol in New York, Hank created a convenient time payment program, claiming that if you couldn't afford the full price of $25 a share, then the program would be willing to accept, quote, the company would be willing to accept, quote, $5 for each share ascribed at the time of subscription, end quote, along with the promise of an additional $5 per share would be paid, quote, each 30 days for 4 months after subscription. If Hank couldn't, quote, pry the money loose from the drunks, end quote, in one lump sum, then he would be more than happy to take it out in 5 monthly installments of $5 each. With these concrete details of past performance and the specifics of his proposal now on the table, Hank then proceeded to list the quote-unquote facts, which he considered pertinent when, quote, considering the possible success of the volume 100 Men, end quote, breaking these quote-unquote facts down under 3 different general headings: publicity, established publisher's opinion, and the possible market.
The first of these, publicity, was the most extensive and to Parkhurst's mind, the most persuasive of all the facts. He listed here 7 numbered items, although the first and last of these were not actually publicity items, but rather about the testimonials provided by doctors regarding, quote, the foundational soundness of the work, end quote, and the fact that, quote, established publishers were confident that this volume seems assured of the most unusual publicity preceding publication of any book they had known, end quote. But sandwiched between these two were 3 short but impressive paragraphs recounting their very positive meetings with This Week, Reader's Digest, and Good Housekeeping, along with 2 reports of the sensational responses to recently published articles. One in the Saturday Evening Post, The Unhappy Drinker, January 15th, 1938, and the other, quote, a very obscure article, end quote, by Dr. Silkworth, which had appeared in, quote, a small New York medical journal, end quote. Reading Hank's enthusiastic retelling of their meetings with all 3 of these magazines, one could easily assume that favorable articles about Alcoholics Anonymous and their new book would be appearing in all 3 simultaneous with the release of the book. This was, of course, simply not true. While Bill and Hank left Reader's Digest with the understanding of a firm commitment, both This Week and Good Housekeeping had expressed grave reservations about the articles and requested further clarification, which was never provided. Next, in, quote, established publisher's opinion, end quote, Parkhurst revealed Harper's office of a $1,500 advance, something the publishers would never do, he said, unless they thought it was a surefire book. And the fact that Richard Walsh of John Day Publishing had met with them and had, among other things, quote, predicted an unusual sale for the volume, end quote. These 2 impressive and well-informed testimonials regarding the marketability of the book from which respected publishing houses should allay any fears regarding the projected sales to be expected once the book was published. Hank then launched into the 3rd general category of facts, quote, the possible market, end quote. And it was here that he abandoned the world of recent past history and began to make some wild predictions of the potential sales for the book. In, quote unquote, Hank's Ideas, his handwritten speculation composed at the beginning of June, he had claimed there were 210,000 clergymen and 169,000 physicians who would surely be interested in buying this book. Now, less than 4 months later, these numbers had more than doubled, with Parkhurst assuring the prospective stock purchaser that this book, quote, should appeal to the 500,000 clergymen in this country and also to the 350,000 physicians, end quote. In addition to these previously considered professions, Hank Parkhurst now added, quote, the 20-odd thousand established psychiatrists, end quote, and noted confidently that, quote, the problem is one of pressing concern to large corporations, and asserted we know also that special reprints should be interesting to insurance companies, end quote. While he had speculated the previous June that, quote, the total would be well over 3 million prospects, end quote, in the face of these newly expanded and much more impressive numbers, Hank was at a loss to even guess the potential market, leaving the final numbers of books they might sell up to the might sell up to the reader's imagination by asking rhetorically, quote, who can estimate the possible sale, end quote.
The quote, corporate setup, end quote.
With this tantalizing question floating in midair, Hank now began the fourth major section of the prospectus that he called, quote unquote, corporate setup. The first half of this presented the, quote, the budget that runs to April 1st, end quote, and outlined the declining scale of profits that would be, quote, apportioned among the stockholders, end quote, parentheses, 80 cents on each of the first 1,000 books, 70 cents each for the next 1,000 books, and 60 cents on the following 2,000, or, close parentheses, or, quote, until the subscriptions have been returned, end quote. The budget, which noted that $1,500 had already, quote, been extended as a loan to ensure the writing of this volume, end quote, listed the following 9 categories along with their costs. Budget to April 1st, 1939, author, $1,000. Directional and sales promotional work, $1,800. Office rent, $480. Steno, $650. Office expense estimated $240. Incidental expense, $500. Printing plates, $700. 1,000 volumes, $350. Artwork, $250, for a total of $5,970. To forestall sticker shock or any too careful questioning of these numbers, Parkhurst immediately followed this budget with a page-long detailed accounting of the projected costs for printing, publishing, and distributing the book. These were the previously mentioned numbers supplied by Richard Walsh of John Day Publishing Company, numbers that promised, quote, an average gross profit of $1.26, end quote, for every volume sold. Finally, Hank had arrived at the punchline of his entire presentation, the section of the prospectus he called simply, quote unquote, profits. Coupling the huge projected market he had so confidently outlined with Richard Walsh's assurance of the substantial amount of profit to be realized on each book, Parkhurst just could not restrain himself as he detailed the fabulous returns anticipated from the surefire investment. By June 1st, the $25 subscriptions would have been returned. Then if the following sales are reached, the profit per share would be $15,000, 15,000 volumes first year per share return after money back, $10. 25,000 volumes, $30. 50,000, $75. 100,000, $150. Although it seems ridiculous, one estimate has been made of 500,000 volumes within 2 years' time. Should this come, over $900 per share would be returned. Having made a fairly well-organized and, for Hank, relatively articulate presentation of all these arguments, the final section, called Operation of the 100 Men Corporation, end quote, seems to be an afterthought, and it reads like something that had just been stuck on the end of this prospectus, the catch-all list of facts and figures that he hadn't been able to blend into the previous text. But in reality, what Parkhurst was primarily trying to address in this section was an objection that would plague Alcoholics Anonymous for many years to come, and had even at this early stage of their development already grown into a burning question. Why did AA need an office and a staff to carry on the work of organizing a program that was basically transmitted by word of mouth by one drunk talking to another? At this time, the primary focus of the question was the shareholders' concern that much of these enticing profits would simply disappear into the overhead costs of maintaining Hank in his office. This question of an official AA office was of particular interest to Hank Parkhurst, since he was the one running that office, and he was totally dependent on it for his livelihood. If the AA office went away, then so did his only current source of income. In justification of maintaining it, Parkhurst asserted that, quote, during the time of the writing of the book and while sales, promotional, and directional duties were going on, the necessity of an office is apparent, end quote. And he mentions several tasks, parentheses, working with Floyd Parsons on a possible Saturday Evening Post article, following up with a host of New York City-based national church offices, canvassing the National Library Board, and securing articles in the American Medical Society's publications, close parentheses, to support that assertion. In addition, he said, once the book was published, quote, if sales are going at a very rapid rate, there would be no question as to the necessity of an office, end quote. Although he conceded that if this most likely of all scenarios did not materialize, then the office would seem to be unnecessary and would be closed.
The prospectus is completed and shares are sold. Over the next couple of weeks, Hank continued to work on the prospectus, adding a decorative title page, reading simply Alcoholics Anonymous, and writing 2 more pages of text before he had the document typeset and professionally printed. The major addition was a full-page quote-unquote foreword, containing, quote, certain information, end quote, that should be known to the reader before considering the, quote, attached proposal, end quote. This included a fairly detailed explanation of the allergy theory of alcoholism, which, according to Hank, quote, informed doctors and psychiatrists, end quote, now considered to be, quote, just as much a disease as cancer, end quote, along with an emphasis on the, quote, indisputable fact that during 1937, 35% of the life insurance turndowns were due to alcoholism, end quote. Taken together, these particulars demonstrate that, quote, there exists today an alcoholic problem which takes its place in seriousness with cancer and syphilis, end quote. In contrast to this distressing situation, quote, over the past 4 years, over 100 true alcoholics have recovered who, from the standpoint of medicine and psychiatry, were considered hopeless, end quote. Noting, quote, these men have dubbed themselves Alcoholics Anonymous, end quote. Parkhurst explained that the name was, quote, adopted because of the nature of the work, because of the desire to keep away from notoriety, and because the work is strictly non-sectarian, end quote. The second new page, which appeared at the very end, was a fill-in-the-blank subscription form to be completed by the stock purchaser and mailed along with a check made payable to the Alcoholic Foundation or to Henry G. Parkhurst, to either Hank at 17 William Street in Newark or to William J. Rodell in Hackettstown.
With the marshaling of all these impressive facts and arguments, Hank went back to the local alcoholics and finally began to sell some shares of stock to them, to their friends, and to a miscellaneous collection of non-alcoholic supporters. As a lot, the New York members were, quote-unquote, pretty poor, and many couldn't afford the $25 needed to purchase a single share of stock. They adopted the 5 monthly payment plan Hank had devised for exactly these circumstances. These buyers agreed to make their first monthly payment on November 15th, solidly placing Hank's greatest sales success in the 2 or 3 weeks immediately prior to that date, and committed to make an additional $5 payment on the 15th of each following month until March 1939. In addition to financially challenged AA members, some of their friends also opted for this time payment program, including several people who bought more than just 1 share of stock. Bill Wilson later claimed that, quote, practically all of the New York members subscribed, end quote, to this initial stock offering. But the official May 15th, 1940 list of subscribers does not support this. Despite Hank's best efforts, there was still considerable resistance in New York to his speculative venture. Of the 43 people and 1 company, Stanox, who did buy shares of stock, only 10 were current AA members, all of whom were from New York, from the New York group, including Jack Darrow, a New York member who moved to Cleveland shortly after the Big Book was published. Because they were never even told about stock or the prospectus, no one in Ohio ever bought a share of stock. A total of 43 recovered alcoholics, friends, relatives, and business relations purchased 179 shares of stock over the next 6 or 7 months, producing an adequate but uneven income stream for Hank Parkhurst that eventually totaled $4,475, and thereby moved his dream of making 100 Men Corporation a successful publishing venture one step closer to reality.
Wow, so that was chapter 15, the 100 Men Corporation in October 1938. You can unmute yourself. I'm sure you will want to. That was good.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you,
Thank you
readers.
so much, Bill.
Everyone,
Thank
very,
you,
very
Bill.
nice.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Fabulous.
readers.
Thank
Thank you,
you all.
David.
It's just a phenomenon. This is really,
Everyone.
Chapter. Wow.
wasn't it a wow?
Amazing.
That's a wow. That's a wow.
Yeah.
Bill, can I just ask you, how long did it take you to put that chapter, compile that chapter together, roughly? I know you might not have the exact. Was
No,
it?
no idea. No idea. I did keep a document of how many pages I did every month. So I mean, and it took me 7 years to write, to actually from the day I started writing to the day I finished writing the very first draft was 7
It's
years.
just a phenomenon.
So-
The amount of information in that, Bill, is just a phenomenon.
Well, David, one of the fun things is, I don't know if it's a fun thing, but I mean, we're reading this chapter and I'm thinking, holy crap, there is a lot of information in here. This is just unbelievable. But what's really, really, really unbelievable, and of course I was overjoyed at this at the time I was doing the research and doing the writing, but what's really unbelievable, that all this information that's in this book was lying fallow in the 80 years between when the book came out and between when my book came out. I mean, it's unbelievable that no one even scratched the surface of all this stuff. I mean, it wasn't like it was locked up and nobody could see it. It was just, I just honestly I can hardly make any sense out of it. But I don't want to blow a lot of smoke at myself here, but I'm reading this thing, I'm thinking, holy crap, there's a lot of stuff here. And of course, then of course the writing skill has to come in. It has to be organized in a way that you can read it and make sense out of it. Those are two different things, doing the research and compiling all the data. So what I would do is, I think I've mentioned this before, David, when I would get to a chapter or a section of the book, I would build a document called October 1938 raw data, and I would take everything I got out of the GSO archive and put it in chronological order. Then I'd go back and take all the stuff I got out of the Stepping Stones archive and insert it in the proper thing. And I would do the same thing with the Brown University stuff and the Akron stuff and the Rockefeller archive stuff. So I had this whole document called October 1938 raw data. And then I would have to take that and kind of start weaving it together into a comprehensive narrative. And it worked well. But again, how shocking is it that this stuff was sitting there? And honest to God, I mean, most of this information has just never been written about or published by Alcoholics Anonymous or somebody who's done similar research 20 years before me or 30 years before me. I mean, I think everybody wants to do a larger book. For instance, Ernie's book is on AA. It's a much, much larger. It's more like 3 steps back, and mine is like down there with a microscope looking at stuff day by day, week by week, month by month. And but I enjoyed reading it today. And I got to recommend, we talked about Eugene Exman here, and Eugene Exman, there's that fabulous book written by Stephen Prothero. It's all about Eugene Exman. It's called God the Bestseller. And if you haven't read, if you're interested in what was going on culturally and all this stuff and who Eugene Exman was and what was going on, there we go. Thank you, Kit. It's just an outstanding book, and there's all kinds of really, really great information in there. And if you're a little reluctant to do that, there's a YouTube presentation I've got on my YouTube channel where I interview Stephen, and he's a wicked interesting guy, and how he came into all this. A private archive. He stumbled on a private archive of materials from Eugene Exman and ended up writing that book. and he's a big deal. I mean, he's written a whole bunch of books on. He was a professor of religion at Boston University. I think it was Boston University. And he's written a bunch of books that that are really, really interesting. He's a serious scholar. So,
now, Mr. Sherberg, we got to listen to you. I got the recording of your share. You done a share for the over 40s last week, and I believe Lady Sarah is doing one tomorrow.
Lady Sarah is up tomorrow. There's no doubt about it. So, you get back to back 7 days apart. There's some overlap there. We'll have to hear how those two things line up. But
well, that's
yeah,
right.
she's got what, 50 minutes or something to tell her story. And Sarah is a great, great, great speaker in my opinion. I mean, I'm very happy that I got to speak first. Because we've been in meetings where we've been asked to both speak, and a couple of times I've had to speak second, and it's like, that's tough duty, man. That's tough duty.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing what she's going to say, because you said electricity was across the room, and you're hoping to see.
Oh man, there was. She verifies that there was electricity. She said she sat down and she looked across the room, and I was sitting there, and she said, "Him."
Wow, that is such a good story, though. It's not a great story, isn't it? Boy meets girl on campus, so to speak. But it's
yeah. And then Bill doesn't go anywhere near a girl for 359 days. So
yes. So that's tomorrow. If you want to jump in on that, that's tomorrow. So there you go. It's on the screen. Eamon is here, so Eamon is involved in that with Penny P, of course. And that's 8 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. UK, and 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And there you go. The code is 701-608-6546, and the password is 033148. Great stuff.
Hey, David, one other thing that was really, really interesting and challenging in relation to this chapter is there's a number of versions of this prospectus in the GSO archive. And they say different things in different places at different times. He's writing the thing and trying to make sense out of that and even trying to, of course, it's important to know which was written first and second and third. And as I remember, don't quote me on this, but as I remember, like one of them said, we now have 5 chapters of the book ready. And then another one said, we now have 10 chapters of the book ready. So, I mean, so it was obvious that one went in front of that one, But yeah, there's huge overlap there. And I'm sure that stuff will be part of the archive that I'm still trying to do the folders for that's going to Brown University. So.
Yeah. And people ask me, Susan, I have the copy of that recording. Eamon sent me that, and I posted it on our WhatsApp, but I can get it to you. We were listening to it during the week. So, Bill, did you want to say anything else? I mentioned that was great. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for reading as much as that you did today. I know that takes a lot. And Jim, thank you, and thank you to all the readers. Appreciate the time and the service. Bill, will we go into the Q&A? I don't know how long we have you for, maybe 10 minutes, maybe, Bill, or 15 minutes. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you. So if you have a question to ask on that particular chapter first, but I know Aisle is here. We might try and get to Aisle in the end of the thing about last week's question, but we try and keep that for the end, because Kevin Hannon was wonderful last week as well, wasn't he? Bill, I maybe I just jump in because no one else is coming in. I noticed, so 14th of October, Charles Towns gave his first check to Alcon, and it was on the 13th of October, 1937, that they met in Akron. I just noticed a year there, almost a year to the day that they had that vote count noses thing. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. It's amazing that there's 600 pages of plus of text here, and it only really covers 18 months.
Yeah, I just don't.
I mean, there's a little bleed over before that and a little bleed over after that, but 18 months, babe. It's like
It's stuff. And Samantha is in Hawaii. Hello, Samantha.
Aloha, everybody. Great to be here. Gosh, this is just now. I know why you've done this so many times, David. There's so much in there, and so many things I was still processing while the reading was going forward, and then I was missing the. And I loved a couple of the things in there of taking a bite of the apple and the pie in the sky. I was just loving those references. And it made me think, and also I have the Reader's Digest thing. I thought, wow, that's really promising. But it was so clear to them how much those questions that were brought forward, it's like, oh, wow, we got to get that we're not together at all. But I have an old Reader's Digest here from 1965, which is the year I was born, and my mum gave it to me in Australia. And I was looking through and I thought, gosh, I wonder if AA had any impact on this, because there's so many chapters in there about humility and all sorts of things. And the last it's multiple stories, multiple writings. The last one in there is I Dare You to Be a Pessimist by Henry Emerson Fosdick. And I just thought, wow, that's so crazy. Anyway, I love how things align. But I did want to ask you if there's any, I mean, there's so much, like you said, so much, and it was so long ago. I wanted to ask you if you have any memorable, oh, this is really good, like an idea of how you wanted to express something, like that sounds perfect, I love it. Were there any memorable ones of those?
Well,
like the pie in the sky and the by the apple?
I love, yeah, when I got to the point of saying that Hank was the serpent in the garden, I was just loving that. I mean, personally, I was loving that as a writing metaphor or something, and then Bill Wilson took a bite, which he did, So, so yeah, I really love that. But then there was other things that, I mean, I've said this before. I kept trying to convince Sarah that I could refer to Henrietta Seiberling as the dragon lady of Oxford Group in Akron, and she just wouldn't let me do it. She must have made me pull it out of there. I kept weaseling it back into the text, and she's like, William, you can't do that. You can't say that. You can't say that. So
awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I love it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Samantha. And who are we going next there? Who's coming in next? It's very strange. Quiet today. There's a lot to take in, I suppose, for some people. There you go, Gigi. Sorry, Gigi, I missed you there. You were up.
I took my hand down because I wasn't sure you wanted to ask this question. I have so many questions, but I'm only going to ask this one, and that is, it's on page 309, where Hank's writing this prospectus, and he's talking about, it says Hank then briefly recounted Bill's trip to Akron and how it resulted in 3 Ohio men recovering. And he goes on and gives this little basic history. Why doesn't he mention the Rockefellers?
Well, they had almost promised those 4 Rockefeller guys they would not mention the fact that Rockefeller gave them money. And quite frankly, the only time I can find any documentation that they did in fact slip on that is Wilson, when he told the story many years later, said that they did happen to mention to, I think it was the guy at the Reader's Digest, that they had got the interest at least of John D. Rockefeller Jr. But yeah, they were I think they worried that if they in fact went public with that to raise more money, for instance, because if John D. Rockefeller's giving them money, what the heck, what's good cause? But they were told not to do that, and I think they felt that if they did do that, they were going to screw the pooch, and then they would never get any money, no matter what. So they didn't do that, and no, I think they were under pretty strict orders not to mention John D. Rockefeller Jr. giving them money. And again, when I say giving him money, that again, Wilson always said he gave it to AA. He didn't give it to AA. He gave it to Dr. Bob. Gave it to Dr. Bob. So it's like, so now you're getting, if you're trying to explain the whole thing, it gets real complicated. And most especially, I think the most complicated thing is John D. Rockefeller Jr. only gave you $5,000. What the hell is going on here? I mean, that's pocket change that falls out of his pants when he's, it's just like $5,000 is nothing to him. So yeah.
Okay, that makes a little bit more sense to me, because it just seems such a disjointed relationship between the fact that they have the non-alcoholic trustees being connected to Rockefeller, and yet they're not allowed to talk about it. It just seems weird.
I know that one of the things I speculate someplace in the book is because they couldn't get any money out of anybody else. And I think one of the things, I think there was, I talk about the incestuous rich, they all talk to each other. So I think the word was on the street that Rockefeller had given him $5,000 and then said, that's it, dude, not another penny. So it's like, Well, what's wrong with this deal? I mean, if Rockefeller's only the richest man in the world is only going to give him $5,000, why should I be coughing up cash? They want me to give them, $100,000 or $50,000 or even another $5,000. So,
But he was willing to give them $5,000. I mean, it just seems like such a negative approach to that.
yeah. Now, Rockefeller did, of course, they did the Rockefeller dinner, much later where they introduced, and they thought they were going to get $1 million worth of contributions out of that. And I don't know the exact numbers. That's past my area of research, but they didn't get a lot of money out of that for sure. And but Chipman did in fact negotiate a loan, as I mentions in this chapter, so that they could buy back the $25 shares. And then they paid Rockefeller back, and they paid everybody back. They paid Charlestown's back. I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting things about the whole deal. They were pitching them as donations that were eventually going to be paid back. I mean, wasn't just we're going to take your money and thank you very much. Did they ever pay the $5,000 back to Rockefeller? I don't think so, because the money went to Dr. Bob. But I don't know. I don't know if they paid that $5,000 back.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Gigi. I'm going to post Bill that recording of Bill sharing last week. It should be in the chat now. That was Bill sharing his experience. And very well done, too, I thought. Bill, and this might take a book to answer this question, Bill. I don't know, but Hank's vision came out for me there. I wonder what Hank, the way you done the presentation about Bill's vision and ever-changing plan. So Hank's vision, I was just thinking while I was doing, what would Hank's vision of AA been? It's interesting what his vision would have been. Would it have been a business? Would AA have been a business? I was just thinking, would it be more of a business?
No, I don't think so. I mean, certainly one of the things he really complained about after he was out drinking and writing Bill letters, snarky letters to Bill Wilson, complaining about really what he felt like now Bill Wilson was turning it into some sort of corporate approach. He talks about, so when did you become the big grand poobah, Bill? He actually calls him the grand poobah in that letter. He's bitching and moaning about that. And quite frankly, Kevin was here last week, and one of the things Kevin and I talk about with regularity is Kevin's doing deep research in the 40s. And he tells me just stories at times, and I can't relate them because they're disconnected. But one of the things he's been very clear about was that the trustees at one point in the 40s, mid 40s, were trying to drive AA and run it like a business and turn it into a corporation, blah blah blah. And Wilson was totally against that, but he didn't have as much arm, and according to Kevin, he doesn't use this phrase, but this is what I get from him talking about it. There was blood on the floor. There was blood on the floor for months and months and months and months. And he finally got that turned around. I don't know, did he get different people on the board? I don't know what that happened, but he stymied they were all businessmen. So they said, oh, let's just run this like a business, and we're not gonna do that. He's not gonna do that. So Wilson finally gets the trustees turned around, so they're working more in the direction he wants in the 40s. And when we get to the 1950s, of course, he's talking about the traditions. The traditions are now in place. And when he gets to the 55 convention, he's ready to launch a general service conference. We're going to run, drunks are going to run this thing. The drunks are going to run this thing. This is going to be a corporation unless 135 drunks or however many come to the general service conference every year all decide on that. So.
Wow. And Kevin was talking. Oh, Kit, go ahead, Kit.
Hi, I'm just amazed when reading this chapter at how much business knowledge that Hank had in making the stocks and how he had all that. I mean, I know he worked for the big rubber corporation, but I did not know that he was that knowledgeable about all this stuff. It just really impresses me that he had all these little details that he could just whip out stocks and prospectuses and so forth.
Yeah,
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, his resume, he worked for Standard Oil. I don't know that he ever worked for a rubber company, but he worked for Standard Oil in a bunch of different jobs, and there was a bunch of different Standard Oils because they broke the company up in 1912. Although I still can't understand how you break up a company and they're all called Standard Oil. of New Jersey and Standard Oil of Indiana and, Standard Oil of Mexico. Anyhow, he was, but he was a savvy guy. And according to his resume, he had a big job. He had, at one point, I think he talks about having 6,000 salesmen reporting to him. I mean, he was a corporate guy. He was a corporate guy. Bill Wilson wasn't a corporate guy. He was a freebooter. He was some sort of entrepreneurial stock speculator is really what the hell he was, and but Parker's had a serious history of business. One thing that, again, I'm back to Kevin. Kevin's done a lot of reading of, like, when Bill and Lois get in the motorcycle and they go to Florida and back and they stop at all these places, and Wilson writes all these reports recommending some guys get together and buy stock in this company because he figures it's undervalued. And I have not read these things. I have not seen these things. But Kevin Hanlon swears that those things are brilliant business documents that Bill Wilson wrote in the 1920s. He's just, anytime I kind of scratch the surface of that thing, he just gets lyrical about and then he says this, and then he ties that in with, after the First World War, this happened over here.
Wow.
And so one of these days I'll get a look at those things. But
Kevin was talking about the book. We did mention the book to him. He said he might do the book about the 40s. And Bill, I've just put this in the chat if you can see it. Kevin was talking about the traditions, what you mentioned there last week. And I just put it, if anyone wanted to listen to that, I listened back to it. It's just wonderful how Wilson recognized the traditions, what you just said there. How Wilson was talking about the traditions long before, he put them together.
The second time I read Not God, what knocked me out was, Wilson, Wilson he created the 12 steps. That whole thing about, these are the steps we took is a bunch of BS. But he created the 12 steps. But then, he pulled from all kinds of different places and things, and there were things going on there at the time. But the second time I read Ernie's book, I was floored by the fact that those 12 traditions came out of Bill Wilson and Bill Wilson alone, his experience dealing with problems. And if you need another example of Bill Wilson's genius, I think those 12 traditions speak mightily to what a brilliant guy he was, really.
The vision he had, Bill, that you put across very well in your presentation, the vision he had, right?
Yeah. But of course, as they say, the 12 steps are how people get sober, and the 12 traditions are how the organization keeps moving along without going ass end up,
And here we are, which is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, with people all over the map here,
It's now. If anyone else haven't got a question, because Sarah, if Bill is going off, Sarah and they have lunch, I believe, at this time of the day. Am I right in saying that, Bill?
Dinner. We're having dinner.
Dinner. Now, I want to thank you, of course, again. We did miss you last week. I have to be honest. We did miss you only for a while. But Kevin got going, though. We kind of forgot about you. But that's a joke. That's a joke, Bill.
No, he
was very good, Kevin, wasn't he, guys? We all really appreciated him last week. And Bill, so if we're going to close now, Bill, if that's okay with you in your traditional way, I think. Let me just get that ready. If anyone want to say something before we go, please do. But if not, we're going back to Mr. Sherberg. No. Oh, Samantha's jumping back in again to hello us again.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it was great to have Kevin, and it just reminded me of the gratitude of all the non-alcoholic supporters recognizing what magic, the real magic, how amazing this is, and how inspired they are by what we have here. And it was great to have him. I can't remember what I was going to say because now I have the evening gathering in front of me, which is my cue to stop talking.
No.
But I did want to say that he was wonderful, and all the non-alcoholic supporters. It's been such a blessing to AA. Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha. Wonderful stuff. And we go back to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
All right, let's have a moment of silence. We want to close with the evening gatha. And forgive me, all the Buddhist prayers aren't supplication of a supreme being. They're reminders to myself, so I will personalize this when I say it because it's not something I'm telling you. It's something I need to tell myself. Moment of silence, please. Let me respectfully remind you, William, Life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. Each of us should strive to awaken to the present moment. Take heed. This night, this very night, your days are diminished by one. Do not squander what precious little time you have left in your life.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Bill. Thank you, Bill, very, very much.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Bill.
Yes, thank
Thank you,
you.
Bill. What a great
Yeah.
lesson.
Yeah. I
Thank you,
read
Bill.
part of your book, Bill, at my home group. I'm doing a little blurb on history every Thursday, and they ate it up. I read about just from the very beginning about Bill's storytelling.
Yeah.
And that I'm picking all different things every week just for the month of May, and they ate it up. And I hope somebody's here from it. I told them about growing and understanding it.